For 30 years, people thought they knew Don Mattingly. They knew the mustache. They knew the swing. They knew the calm face beneath the Yankees' cap. The quiet captain who seemed too controlled to break, too disciplined to complain, too respected to disappear. To millions of baseball fans, he was Donnie Baseball, the kind of name that did not sound like a nickname anymore, but like a title carved into Yankee Stadium itself. Yet the strange thing about Don Mattingly's life is that the more people admired him, the less they truly saw him. On the field, he looked like the perfect baseball man, steady, clean, loyal, almost old-fashioned in the way he carried himself. But behind that public image was another life, a quieter and heavier one, built out of pain, mistiming, private disappointment, and the cruel knowledge that greatness does not always arrive with a happy ending. That is the double life Don Mattingly lived for decades. Not a scandalous secret hidden in shadows, not some tabloid betrayal waiting to be exposed, but something far more human. The life of a man celebrated as a legend, while quietly carrying the burden of everything baseball never gave back to him. And perhaps that is why what is happening now feels so hard to watch. Because in 2026, when many men of his generation would have stepped comfortably into memory, Mattingly found himself pulled back into the storm. Philadelphia, a city that does not whisper when it is angry, suddenly placed him in the middle of a collapsing season. The Phillies were not merely losing games, they were losing belief. A roster built with money, expectation, and championship ambition had started to look strangely empty. The fans were frustrated, the headlines sharpened, and the organization needed someone to stand in front of the damage. Then came Don Mattingly, not as the young Yankee hero people remembered, not as the smooth left-handed hitter who once made the impossible look routine, but as a 65-year-old baseball lifer asked to take control of a team already drifting toward crisis. The scene almost felt unreal. After all these years, after the injuries, the managerial chapters, the near misses, and the endless waiting for the one championship moment that always seemed to belong to someone else, Mattingly was back under the lights again. But this time, there was no clean romance in it. There was pressure, there was urgency, there was the uncomfortable feeling that baseball, the game he had given his life to, was once again asking him to absorb another difficult chapter without complaint. That has always been the hidden pattern of Don Mattingly's story. He gave the Yankees his prime, but his prime arrived during one of the franchise's most frustrating eras. He became the face of baseball's most famous team, but not during its dynasty. He played with excellence, loyalty, and pain. Yet when the Yankees finally rose again, when the rings finally came, Mattingly was no longer in uniform. The parade moved forward without the man who had helped keep the flame alive through the dark years. To fans, that became a heartbreaking piece of trivia. To Mattingly, it must have been something much deeper. The knowledge that timing can be just as powerful as talent. Imagine giving everything to a team, becoming its symbol, carrying its disappointment with dignity, and then watching the gates of glory open just after you walked away. That is not the kind of wound that shows up in a box score. It does not appear beside batting average, home runs, RBIs, or gold gloves. It lives somewhere else, in the private space between pride and regret. And that private space is where the second Don Mattingly existed. The first Don was the public figure, respected, composed, almost impossible to dislike. The second Don was the man who had to live with the weight of what almost happened, almost a dynasty, almost a World Series, almost a Hall of Fame certainty before injuries altered the arc, almost the perfect ending. For 30 years, people kept calling him one of the greatest Yankees never to win it all. But very few stopped to ask what it must feel like to have your greatness defined by the one thing missing from it. That phrase sounds like praise, but it also locks a man inside his disappointment. And still, Mattingly did not run from the game. He returned as a coach. He managed in Los Angeles. He managed in Miami. He sat in dugouts, studied hitters, guided younger men, and kept chasing the rhythm of baseball long after baseball had already taken its toll on his body and his legacy. That is why this new chapter in Philadelphia feels less like a comeback and more like a mirror. Don Mattingly is not simply managing another team. He is standing once more at the intersection of expectation and heartbreak, where everyone wants a savior, but no one can promise salvation. And now, with his own son Preston in the front office, the story becomes even more complicated. Father and son, legacy and pressure, family and business, all placed inside one of the harshest sports cities in America. For fans, it is fascinating. For Mattingly, it may be deeply personal, because the man who once carried the Yankees through years without a crown is now being asked to carry another proud franchise through a season that began to fall apart before he fully had his hands on it. The world sees the headline, "Don Mattingly takes over," but the real story is quieter. It is about a man who has spent his life being admired for his strength, while rarely being allowed to show the cost of that strength. It is about a baseball icon who lived two lives for 30 years, one in the bright light of public respect, and one in the long shadow of unfinished dreams. And now, as he walks back into the dugout, older, quieter, and still searching for the ending baseball owes him, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Is this finally Don Mattingly's last chance at redemption, or just another painful chapter in a career defined by almost? Before Don Mattingly became a name that sounded inseparable from Yankee Stadium, he was just a kid from Evansville, Indiana, growing up far away from the noise, money, and mythology of New York. That part matters, because nothing about him seemed manufactured for the spotlight. He did not arrive with the swagger of a man desperate to be famous. He did not speak like someone who needed the room to know he was special. He came from a place where baseball was not a brand, not a media machine, not a daily argument on sports radio, but something simpler: a field, a glove, a bat, repetition, discipline, and the quiet belief that if you did the work long enough, the game would eventually tell the truth about you. And for a while, the game did exactly that. Mattingly's rise was not built on spectacle. It was built on precision. His swing looked compact, almost calm, as if he had removed every unnecessary movement until only the truth remained. He was not the loudest player, not the flashiest personality, not the kind of young athlete who forced cameras to chase him. But the ball kept finding the barrel. The numbers kept rising. The coaches kept noticing. And eventually, the New York Yankees, a franchise that has always treated first base like a position of inheritance, began to realize they had something rare. A player who did not merely want to wear the uniform, but seemed born to respect its weight. That is where the public Don Mattingly began. By the mid-1980s, he was no longer just another promising hitter. He was becoming the face of the Yankees at a time when the franchise desperately needed one. In 1984, he won the American League batting title, and in 1985, he became the American League Most Valuable Player after a season that turned him from excellent into unforgettable. Over his career, he would become a six-time All-Star, win 9 Gold Gloves, and build one of the most respected Yankees resumes of his generation. But numbers alone do not explain why fans loved him. New York does not fall in love easily, especially not with quiet men. It tests them first. It watches how they fail, how they answer boos, how they carry losing streaks, how they stand when the city turns impatient. Mattingly passed that test because he gave people something they trusted. He looked like stability in an unstable era. He looked like professionalism when the Yankees were not yet the machine they would become in the late 1990s. He looked like a captain before he officially carried the title. And maybe that was the beginning of the double life. Because the more fans needed him to symbolize strength, the less room he had to appear human. Every franchise has players who become more than players. They become emotional property. Fans attach their childhoods to them, their fathers' stories, their summers, their idea of what the team used to mean. Mattingly became that kind of figure. To Yankees fans who lived through those years, he was not simply a first baseman. He was proof that even when the organization fell short, dignity still existed in pinstripes. But that kind of love has a cost. When people turn you into a symbol, they stop seeing the private pressure underneath. They forget that a symbol still wakes up in pain. A symbol still knows when his body is changing. A symbol still hears the clock. And Mattingly's clock began ticking much earlier than anyone wanted to admit. The back problems that later reshaped his career did not simply reduce statistics. They changed the entire emotional meaning of his story. One day, he looked like a future Hall of Fame certainty, a man whose path seemed already drawn toward Cooperstown. Then gradually, cruelly, the game began taking pieces away. Not all at once, not dramatically enough for one clean headline, but slowly, in the way that is hardest for a great athlete to accept. A little less power, a little more pain, more adjustment, more compromise. More mornings when the body did not feel like the legend people still expected to see. That is the part fans rarely understand. Decline is not just physical, it is psychological. For a player like Mattingly, whose identity had been built on control, discipline, and reliability, the betrayal of the body must have felt almost personal. He could still think the game. He could still see the pitch. He could still compete with pride. But the body that once made him look inevitable was no longer giving him the same answer. Yet the public image remained frozen. Fans still saw Donnie Baseball. Opposing teams still treated him with respect. Broadcasters still spoke his name with reverence. But inside that public admiration was a private fight that no applause could solve. That is why the tragedy of Don Mattingly is not loud. It is not the tragedy of collapse, disgrace, or scandal. It is the quieter tragedy of a man who became great enough to be remembered forever, but was hurt just early enough to make everyone wonder what else he could have been. The first life was the myth, the smooth swing, the gold gloves, the Yankee captain, the beloved star. The second life was the ache behind it, the pain, the timing, the knowledge that history was moving just out of reach. And as the years passed, that gap between the man people celebrated and the man who had to live with the unfinished ending would only grow wider. The cruelest part of Don Mattingly's story is that his greatness did not disappear because he stopped caring, stopped working, or stopped understanding the game. It was not laziness, it was not arrogance, it was not the slow unraveling that sometimes follows fame. It was his body, and when the body begins to argue with greatness, even the strongest mind can only negotiate for so long. For years, Mattingly had looked like the safest kind of superstar, controlled, polished, fundamentally sound. The kind of player whose excellence felt repeatable because it was built on craft rather than chaos. He was not a hitter who depended only on raw violence. He did not need to turn every at-bat into theater. His brilliance came from timing, balance, recognition, and a swing so direct that it seemed almost impossible for him to be fooled for long. That was why the decline felt so strange. Fans could still see the baseball intelligence. They could still see the hands. They could still see the pride. But there were moments when the ball no longer jumped the same way, when the swing looked just slightly changed, when the player inside the uniform was still Don Mattingly. But the physical certainty that once surrounded him had begun to fade. And that is the kind of change that breaks a great athlete quietly. A torn reputation can be defended. A bad season can be explained. A slump can be fought with extra work. But when your own back becomes the invisible opponent, when the pain lives underneath every movement, when every swing carries the question of whether your body will betray you again, the battle becomes something far more private. Mattingly did not have the luxury of suffering in silence completely, because New York watches everything. Every dip in production becomes a conversation. Every grimace becomes evidence. Every adjustment becomes a headline waiting to happen. Yet even under that pressure, he remained almost stubbornly dignified. He did not build his identity around complaint. He did not turn his injuries into a public performance. That restraint made fans respect him even more, but it also made the hidden life heavier. Because when a man refuses to make his pain the center of the story, people sometimes forget the pain is there at all. They simply remember the numbers changing. They remember the power decreasing. They remember the championship window closing. They remember the almost. But behind each of those memories was a player trying to hold together a version of himself that the game was slowly taking away. That is what makes Mattingly's prime feel so haunting in hindsight. There was a stretch when he looked not merely like one of the best players in baseball, but like a man building a Hall of Fame case in real time. Then the arc bent. The injuries came. The Yankees around him were not ready to become champions, and the sport, which can be merciless with timing, refused to wait. For Mattingly, the pain was not only that his body declined. It was that the decline happened before the story had reached its natural ending. Fans often talk about athletes as if careers are supposed to follow clean, dramatic structure: rise, dominance, championship, farewell. But real sports rarely behave so neatly. Sometimes the greatest years arrive when the team is still broken. Sometimes the body breaks down just as the organization begins to find itself. Sometimes the player who carried the burden through the difficult years is gone when the reward finally arrives. Mattingly lived that exact cruelty. He was the bridge between eras, but history tends to celebrate the destination more than the bridge. The Yankees dynasty of the late 1990s became one of the defining baseball stories of its time, filled with rings, parades, legends, and October moments replayed forever. But Mattingly's fingerprints were on the emotional foundation that came before it. He gave fans a reason to keep believing when belief was not easy. He represented the uniform when the uniform was not producing championships. He held the line. Then, just as the franchise was about to step into glory, his playing days ended. That is not a normal kind of disappointment. It is the kind that can follow a man for decades, even if he never says so out loud, because the public will still honor him, still chant his name, still tell younger fans how great he was. But somewhere inside, he knows the story has a missing scene. No World Series celebration as the star, no final October coronation. No image of Don Mattingly lifting the trophy in pinstripes, the moment that would have made the myth complete. Instead, his legacy became one of baseball's most painful what-ifs. What if his back had held up? What if the Yankees had been better earlier? What if his prime had overlapped with the dynasty? What if the game had given him just 2 more healthy years at the right time? These questions sound harmless when fans ask them, but for the person who lived them, they are not trivia. They are ghosts. And for Mattingly, those ghosts did not vanish when he left the field. They followed him into coaching, into managing, into every dugout, where he tried to turn experience into guidance for someone else. That is the second life again. The visible role of respected baseball man, and the invisible burden of a career that everyone praises while quietly defining it by absence. Maybe that is why Mattingly stayed close to the game for so long. Maybe walking away would have meant accepting the unfinished ending as final. Maybe managing gave him another way to chase the chapter he never got as a player. But managing is not a peaceful second act. It is another form of exposure. Every decision is judged. Every losing streak becomes personal. Every roster flaw somehow lands at your feet. And still, Mattingly kept choosing baseball. That choice says something powerful about him, but also something heartbreaking. The game hurt him, denied him, delayed him, and left him with one of the most bittersweet legacies in Yankees history. Yet he kept returning, not because it was easy, but because the game had become the language of his life. And once baseball becomes your language, silence can feel even more painful than failure. When Don Mattingly finally left the field as a player, the world treated it like the end of a beautiful but unlucky story. The fans mourned what he never got. The Yankees moved forward, baseball kept turning, and soon the cruelest twist arrived. The moment Mattingly had spent his entire career chasing appeared almost immediately after he was gone. In 1996, the Yankees won the World Series, beginning the dynasty that would define a generation. To fans, it was a celebration. To New York, it was a return to order. To baseball history, it was the rebirth of the most powerful brand in the sport. But for anyone who remembered the years before the rings, there was an unavoidable ache beneath the champagne. Don Mattingly was not there. The man who had carried the Yankees through years of frustration. The captain who gave the franchise dignity when titles felt distant. The face who kept the uniform respected during the waiting period, had missed the parade by one season. One season. That is the kind of timing that can feel almost too cruel to be real. And yet Mattingly did what he always seemed to do. He absorbed it with class. He did not turn bitterness into a public identity. He did not spend the next decade reminding everyone that he deserved better. He did not attack the organization or demand sympathy from the fans. Instead, he became something even more difficult. A beloved almost champion, a man whose absence from the dynasty somehow made people love him more, but also trapped him forever in the sentence, if only. If only he had stayed one more year. If only his back had allowed it. If only the championship had arrived earlier. If only the baseball gods had been a little kinder. And those words, repeated for decades, became part of the double life. Publicly, they sounded like affection. Privately, they must have carried weight. Because praise built around what you missed is never simple praise. It is admiration with a wound inside it. Every time fans honored him, they also reminded him of the one image that did not exist. Don Mattingly in the middle of a World Series celebration as a Yankee player. That missing image became a ghost in his legacy. It followed him because baseball is a sport obsessed with endings. A great swing is remembered, but a ring changes how a career is discussed. A beloved player can become immortal in one city, but October glory gives history a cleaner sentence. Mattingly's career never got that clean sentence. It got something more complicated, more human, and maybe more painful. He was great, but unlucky. Revered, but ringless. Complete as a player, yet somehow remembered through incompletion. That contradiction could have pushed a different man away from the game. It could have made him retreat into resentment. Instead, Mattingly stayed close. He returned to baseball not as the superstar everyone protected, but as a coach, then as a manager, stepping into the part of the sport where patience is thin and blame travels quickly. That decision revealed something important about him. Don Mattingly did not simply love being great at baseball. He loved baseball itself, even after it wounded him. He loved the daily rhythm, the clubhouse language, the endless adjustments, the strange emotional economy of a long season. He understood that the game is not only played in the ninth inning or in October, but in the small conversations before batting practice, in the way a young hitter handles failure, in the quiet correction of a defensive angle, in the decision to trust a player before the numbers fully justify it. As a coach and manager, Mattingly entered a new life where his name still carried respect. But respect could not protect him from criticism. Managing the Los Angeles Dodgers placed him inside another high-expectation machine. The Dodgers had talent, money, history, and a fan base hungry for a breakthrough. Mattingly guided strong teams, reached the postseason, and looked at times like a man inching closer to the ending that had escaped him as a player. But again, baseball offered him proximity instead of completion. The Dodgers were good, sometimes very good, but the final step remained out of reach. The pattern repeated with a different uniform, near enough to believe, far enough to hurt. Then came Miami, a different kind of challenge, less glamorous but perhaps more revealing. With the Marlins, Mattingly was not managing a smooth machine built only for October expectation. He was managing instability, transition, limited resources, and the emotional weight of a franchise that often seemed to restart before it could fully grow. In 2020, he was named National League Manager of the Year, a recognition that proved his baseball mind still commanded respect. But even that honor carried a familiar irony. It validated him without delivering the ultimate reward. Again he was admired, again he was praised, again the story stopped short of triumph. That is why the phrase, double life, fits him so well as an emotional truth. One life is the life everyone sees, the respected icon, the steady professional, the man who moved from star player to manager without ever losing his dignity. The other life is the life underneath, a career spent circling baseball's biggest prize, without ever fully holding it in the role people expected. Player, coach, manager, mentor, survivor. Every title brought him closer to the game, but none erased the original absence. And maybe that is what makes Don Mattingly different from so many other legends. He never became bitter enough to be consumed by what he missed, but he never moved far enough away for the wound to disappear. Baseball remained both his home and his unfinished business. Every dugout was familiar, but every season also reopened the old question. Could this be the year the story finally changes? Could this be the chapter that gives him what the Yankees' years did not? Or was he destined to become one of those figures the game keeps honoring, precisely because it never quite rewarded him. Now, looking back, his post-playing career does not feel like a simple second act. It feels like a long negotiation with fate. Don Mattingly kept returning to the field, not because he needed applause, but because the game still had a debt in his mind, even if he would never say it that way. And the heartbreaking part is that baseball does not always pay its debts. Sometimes it simply gives a man another uniform, another clubhouse, another season, another chance to stand in front of expectation and pretend the past is not standing there beside him. By the time Don Mattingly arrived in Philadelphia, he was no longer chasing the game as a young man. He was not trying to prove he belonged in a major league clubhouse. He had already done that as a player, as a captain, as a coach, and as a manager. His name carried the weight of decades. His face carried the wear of a life spent inside baseball's pressure chambers. And yet, somehow, the game found a way to put him back in the middle of another storm. That is the strange thing about men like Mattingly. They do not always choose the drama. Sometimes the drama recognizes them. Philadelphia was not supposed to be the place where the old wound reopened, but it quickly became exactly that. This was not a quiet baseball city looking for patience. This was Philadelphia, where disappointment does not stay polite for long, where fans can love a team with frightening intensity and punish it with the same force when belief begins to crack. The Phillies were built to matter. They were not supposed to drift through the season like a team searching for an identity. They had stars, money, expectations, and a fan base that did not want explanations. They wanted urgency. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone to stop the bleeding. And suddenly, there was Don Mattingly, standing again in the place where admiration offers no protection. The old nickname, the old Yankee memories, the old respect around his career, none of it could win games for him now. Baseball is sentimental only before first pitch. After that, it becomes cold. It asks what you can fix today. It asks why the bullpen failed. It asks why the lineup looks lifeless. It asks why a team with so much talent can look so fragile. And for Mattingly, this new chapter carried an emotional complication unlike any before it. His son, Preston Mattingly, was part of the front office world around the Phillies. That detail made the story feel almost cinematic, but also dangerous in a very human way. Because baseball had never been just a job for the Mattingly family. It had been an inheritance, a language passed through years, through clubhouses, through scouting reports, through the quiet understanding that the game can give a family identity while also taking pieces of its peace. For a father, there is pride in seeing a son rise in the same world. But there is pressure, too. When the team struggles, every connection becomes a headline. Every decision can be read through the lens of family. Every failure feels less private. And that is where Don Mattingly's double life became even more visible. On the outside, he was the experienced baseball man stepping into a difficult assignment. On the inside, he was a father, a former star, an aging manager, and a man whose entire career had taught him that baseball rarely gives clean gifts. It gives opportunity wrapped in pressure. It gives respect tied to risk. It gives another chance, but never without reminding you of every chance that came before. Imagine walking into that clubhouse knowing the public sees you as a stabilizer, perhaps even as a temporary solution, while privately understanding that no manager can repair everything with speeches and lineup cards alone. A struggling team is never just one problem. It is confidence, it is rhythm, it is health, it is chemistry, it is timing. It is the quiet fear that spreads when talented players begin to doubt what should have been automatic. Mattingly knew that better than most because he had lived baseball from nearly every angle. He knew what it felt like to be the player everyone depended on. He knew what it felt like to play hurt. He knew what it felt like to be praised and questioned in the same breath. He knew what it felt like when a season began slipping away, while people outside the clubhouse searched for one person to blame. That knowledge made him valuable, but it also made the job heavier. Because experience does not remove pain. Sometimes it simply helps a man recognize pain sooner. And perhaps that is why the image of Mattingly in this moment feels so hard to watch. There is dignity in him, but also exhaustion. There is still authority, but not the illusion that authority can control everything. The younger Don Mattingly once stood at first base in Yankee Stadium, carrying the hopes of a franchise that was not yet ready to reward him. The older Don Mattingly now stood in another dugout, carrying the expectations of a franchise that needed answers immediately. Different uniform, different city, different era, but the emotional shape was painfully familiar. Once again, he was being asked to represent calm in the middle of noise. Once again, he was being asked to carry pressure that did not begin with him. Once again, he was close enough to the center of the story to be judged by its ending, even if he did not write the beginning. That has always been the unfair bargain of Don Mattingly's baseball life. He is admired for his steadiness, so people keep handing him unstable situations. They trust his dignity, so they ask him to stand in front of disappointment. They respect his name, so they expect his presence to heal problems deeper than one man can reach. And maybe he accepts it because that is who he has always been. The man who does not run from the hard inning, even when the score is already against him. But beneath that loyalty is something heartbreaking. Baseball has spent decades asking Don Mattingly to give more than it returns. It gave him love, but not the perfect ending. It gave him respect, but not the ring as a player. It gave him managerial chances, but rarely easy ones. And now, late in life, it gave him Philadelphia, a city of passion, pressure, and impossible expectations, where one more chapter of his unfinished story would be written in public. The world may see a veteran manager taking over a team, but the deeper story is a man walking back into the same emotional fire he has known since the Yankees' years, still trying to prove that patience, class, and baseball intelligence can survive in a sport that often rewards only the final score. The hardest thing about Don Mattingly's story is that he has never been easy to pity. Some athletes invite sympathy because their pain is loud, visible, dramatic, almost impossible to miss. Mattingly was different. His suffering was controlled. His disappointments were carried with a straight back, even when that back had betrayed him. His voice never seemed designed for outrage. His face never seemed comfortable asking the world to feel sorry for him. And because of that, people often mistook his composure for peace. They assumed that because he handled heartbreak with dignity, the heartbreak must not have cut very deep. But dignity does not erase pain. Sometimes it only teaches pain how to stay quiet. That may be the truest meaning of the double life he lived for so long. Publicly, Don Mattingly was the model baseball man, the one people pointed to when they wanted to talk about class, professionalism, humility, and loyalty. Privately, he was a man forced to keep making peace with things that never quite resolved. His playing career did not end in scandal or disgrace, but in physical limitation and brutal timing. His Yankees legacy did not fade, but it remained unfinished. His managerial career did not fail in a humiliating way, but it kept placing him near the edge of something bigger without letting him fully cross over. That kind of life can be more difficult than a clean tragedy, because nothing is simple enough to rage against. There is no single villain, no single mistake, no single moment where everything went wrong. Instead, there is a long chain of almosts, and almost is one of the cruelest words in sports. Almost means you were good enough to dream. Almost means the door opened just wide enough for you to see what was inside. Almost means people will praise you forever, but always with a shadow attached. Don Mattingly knows that shadow better than most. He was almost the Yankee who bridged the old frustration to the new dynasty. Almost the Hall of Fame certainty before injury changed the math. Almost the manager who turned strong teams into unforgettable ones. Almost the man whose baseball life received the perfect correction in its final act. And now, standing in another dugout with another franchise's expectations pressing against him, that word returns again. Almost. Could Philadelphia be the place where the narrative finally shifts? Or will it become another chapter in the same painful pattern? Another reminder that respect and reward do not always arrive together. That is what makes this moment so emotional. It is not simply about wins and losses. It is about whether a man can spend his whole life inside a game and still feel like the game is holding something back from him. For fans, baseball can be nostalgia. For players and managers, it can be identity. For Mattingly, it became both home and unfinished business. He never really left it, even when it hurt him. He kept returning because the field was where he understood himself best. But returning also meant reopening the wound. Every new job carried hope, and every hope carried risk. Every season offered a possible ending, and every ending threatened to repeat the past. That is the emotional trap of a man like Don Mattingly. He is too respected to be forgotten, but too unfinished to be free. People still speak his name with warmth, but warmth cannot rewrite October. They still remember the sweet swing, but memory cannot give him the parade he missed. They still admire his managerial mind, but admiration cannot protect him when a team starts losing. In Philadelphia, all of that history stands behind him, whether the fans choose to see it or not. Every camera shot of Mattingly in the dugout carries more than the current score. It carries Evansville. It carries Yankee Stadium. It carries the MVP season. It carries the aching back. It carries 1996 without him. It carries Los Angeles. It carries Miami. It carries the long years of being close to baseball's most important rooms, but not always standing in the center when the celebration began. And perhaps the most painful part is that Mattingly himself would probably never frame it this dramatically. He would likely talk about the players, the work, the next game, the need to compete, the importance of staying steady. That is what baseball men do. They reduce emotion into routine, because routine is survivable. But viewers can feel what he may never say. They can see the age in his face now, the years layered behind the eyes, the quiet discipline of someone who has learned not to expect fairness from the sport he loves. And still he shows up. That is the part that makes him compelling. Don Mattingly keeps showing up, not as a man chasing celebrity, not as a man begging for sympathy, not as a man trying to turn his pain into a brand. He shows up because baseball is the place where his life made sense, even when it refused to make peace with him. There is something noble in that, but also something sad. Because loyalty becomes complicated when the thing you are loyal to keeps hurting you. Baseball gave Don Mattingly everything people can see: fame, respect, legacy, a beloved nickname, a permanent place in Yankees history. But it also denied him the things people feel most deeply: perfect timing, physical mercy, and the clean ending that would have made the story whole. So when people say he lived a double life, maybe they are finally beginning to understand. One life belonged to the public, the legend, the captain, the manager, the steady face in the dugout. The other belonged only to him, the pain behind the calm, the regret behind the respect, the unfinished dream behind the applause. And now, late in the story, baseball has called his name again. Whether that call becomes redemption or another reminder of what he has never been given, no one can know yet. But watching Don Mattingly answer it, after everything, feels less like sports news and more like a final test of the man behind the myth. In the end, the story of Don Mattingly is not really about a secret life being exposed. It is about the life people never looked closely enough to understand. For decades, fans saw the surface clearly. The beautiful swing, the Yankees uniform, the captain's presence, the calm manager in the dugout, the baseball man who seemed to move through pressure without ever being consumed by it. But beneath that surface was a quieter story, and maybe that story is more powerful because it was never shouted. Don Mattingly lived for 30 years between two identities. One was the identity the public gave him: legend, professional, leader, gentleman, Donnie Baseball. The other was the identity baseball forced him to carry privately. The man who gave everything, came painfully close, and still never received the clean ending everyone believed he deserved. That is why his name still creates such a complicated feeling among those who remember him. It is admiration, but not only admiration. It is love, but not only love. It is nostalgia mixed with regret, respect mixed with sadness, and pride mixed with the strange ache of unfinished business. Few athletes become so beloved without a championship moment to freeze them forever in victory. Fewer still remain so respected after decades of near misses, managerial pressure, and public scrutiny. But Mattingly did. He survived not because the game was gentle with him, but because he refused to let its unfairness turn him small. That may be the quiet triumph inside the tragedy. He never became bitter enough to destroy the image people loved. He never allowed disappointment to become his whole personality. He did not spend his later years attacking the game, resenting the Yankees, or demanding that history rewrite itself around his pain. Instead, he kept working, he kept teaching, he kept showing up in clubhouses where younger players needed guidance, where struggling teams needed steadiness, where organizations needed someone who understood that baseball is not only about talent, but about endurance. In that sense, Mattingly's second life was not only a burden, it was also proof of character. Many people can shine when the story goes perfectly. Far fewer can remain graceful when the story keeps stopping just short of the ending they dreamed about. Don Mattingly became a symbol of that kind of grace. But grace should not be confused with ease. It is easy for fans to say a man handled pain well when they did not have to carry it. It is easy to romanticize his loyalty to the Yankees when they were not the ones watching the dynasty begin immediately after their final season. It is easy to praise his quietness when they were not the ones waking up with the questions that never fully go away. What if the back had held? What if the team had arrived sooner? What if one more season had been possible? What if the ring had come before the body broke down? Those questions do not disappear just because a man learns how to smile through them. They become part of the architecture of his life. They sit behind every public appearance, every interview, every return to the dugout. And now, as Mattingly stands in this late chapter, the emotion around him feels heavier because time has made everything clearer. When he was young, people saw what he was doing. Now, people see what it cost. They see that his greatness existed in an era that did not reward him the way history usually rewards legends. They see that his career was not incomplete because he lacked character, effort, or ability, but because baseball can be brutally indifferent to deserving. That may be hardest truth in his story. Sports are not moral systems. They do not always give the best men the best endings. They do not always match sacrifice with celebration. Sometimes they ask a man to carry a franchise through darkness, then let someone else stand in the light. Sometimes they praise him forever, but leave one empty space in the middle of the tribute. Don Mattingly's empty space is the image everyone can imagine but no one can replay. The Yankee captain, in pinstripes, at the center of a World Series celebration. That moment never happened. And because it never happened, his story became something deeper than a standard sports biography. It became a meditation on timing, loyalty, and the emotional price of almost. Philadelphia may or may not change that. Perhaps this chapter will give him another kind of redemption. Perhaps it will simply remind everyone that baseball still trusts him when things become difficult. Perhaps it will end quietly, without the storybook finish people want to attach to him. But whatever happens, the larger truth has already been written. Don Mattingly's legacy is not defined only by the championship he missed. It is defined by what he did after missing it. He stayed honorable, he stayed useful, he stayed devoted. He continued to give the game his mind long after his body had paid the price. And that is why, even without the perfect ending, he remains one of baseball's most emotionally powerful figures. The double life was never about deception. It was about distance. The distance between the man fans thought they knew and the man who had to live with the weight of being loved for a career that still felt unfinished. Now, after all these years, the truth is not that Don Mattingly fooled anyone. The truth is that baseball fans only saw half the story. They saw the legend. They saw the captain. They saw the calm face in the dugout. But they did not always see the cost of staying calm. They did not always see the private ache behind public respect. They did not always see how heavy it can be to be remembered forever for greatness, and for the one thing greatness never got. And maybe that is why his story still hurts. Because Don Mattingly did not need a scandal to be heartbreaking. All he needed was a lifetime of almosts, carried with enough dignity that most people never noticed how heavy they were.